He screamed, "Hands where I can see them!" just as her hospital bag slid off her shoulder and she instinctively reached to catch it. One crack split the Texas night, her own rules of engagement lecture echoing in her head as she hit the asphalt, blood soaking the same green scrub she'd worn saving lives an hour earlier. By the time the red and blue lights blurred above her, the officer was already rehearsing his line for the cameras. She matched the profile I feared for my life. By the time Major Dr. Lena Harris peeled off her last pair of bloody gloves, San Antonio had slipped past midnight. The OR smelled like antiseptic and metal and the sweet, coppery ghost of blood. The young private on her table had arrived with half his chest open to the air. Now his ribs were wired, his lungs stitched, his heart beating a stubborn rhythm under a neat line of staples. Somewhere upstairs, a monitor would beep all night because she'd refused to let him die. Lena stood there a second longer than she should have, gloved hands hovering over the blue drapes, listening to the hum of machines. Then she stepped back, nodded to the circulating nurse, and let the scrub tech start breaking down the field. "Go home, ma'am," one of the residents said softly. "You've been on for 20 hours. 24, Lena corrected, because precision was a hard habit to break. But who's counting? Her body was counting. Every muscle in her back ached. The skin under her scrubs felt coated in someone else's fear. She pushed through the double doors into the harsh fluorescence of the corridor and made herself walk past the family waiting rooms, past the vending machines, past the framed army posters about courage and honor and rules of engagement. That last one always made her smile, just a little. Most of the surgeons in this hospital stitched arteries and repaired bones. Lena did that and something else besides. 3 evenings a week, she stripped off her gloves, sat in a briefing room, and lectured officers and commanders on what they were allowed to do with the power the country had put in their hands. What force is reasonable, what I was afraid does and does not excuse, where human rights begin and end. She was very good at those lectures. In the empty staff locker room, she changed out of her surgical clogs into worn sneakers, shrugged on a soft army sweatshirt over her green scrubs, and slung her bag over one shoulder. Her ID badge hung from a lanyard around her neck, the laminated plastic scuffed, the corner permanently stained from a night in Kandahar when a medic had handed it back to her with a quiet, "Ma'am, you might want to wash this." The blood had never quite faded. She looked at the badge in the mirror now. Harris, Lena M., Madge, MC, U.S. Army. Underneath, in smaller print, an extra line, ROA, Human Rights Advisor. She still wasn't sure whether that last part made her safer in the world or more of a target. The staff lot was mostly empty, rows of cars gleaming dully under sodium lights. The Texas night wrapped around her as she stepped outside, warm, heavy, the air still humming from the day's heat. Cicadas buzzed somewhere beyond the chain-link fence. Her sedan waited in the second row, as ordinary as she could make it. 4 years old, payments almost done, the color dealership gray. She thumbed the unlock button, and the headlights winked once, throwing pale light over concrete and chain link and shadows. For a moment, she just stood there with the door open, one hand on the roof, eyes closed. Her whole body hummed with leftover adrenaline, the crash that always came when the OR went quiet. She thought about the private's chest cavity, about the way his heart had stuttered and surged when they unclamped the aorta. She thought about the presentation she'd given that morning, to a room full of MPs about proportional force and threat perception. She thought, fleetingly, about how many people had died because someone misread fear. Then she slid behind the wheel, buckled herself in, and pulled out of the lot. On the other side of the city, a patrol car cruised under the yellow haze of streetlights. Officer Mark Dwyer drove with one hand on the wheel and one hand on his coffee, the cup wedged under the dash light so he could see the level. 12 years on the force had carved grooves into his brain. Certain streets meant certain problems, certain faces meant certain risks. In the passenger seat, Officer Carlos Vega stared out into the dark, still close enough to the academy that the creases in his uniform were sharper than the lines on his face. "Graveyard shift," Dwyer muttered. "Nothing but drunk college kids and domestic calls if we're lucky." "If we're lucky," Vega echoed, but he didn't sound like he believed it. They caught sight of her on the access road to I-10, a dark sedan drifting just slightly between lanes, then correcting, indicator blinking late before a turn. Spotlight from the patrol car washed over the rear window for a moment. and Vega saw the driver's silhouette. Smallish, shoulders slumped, hair tied back. For a second, he thought about being 24 and exhausted and just wanting his bed. Dwyer thought about something else. "It's always the nice cars," he said. "Middle of the night, wrong side of town. I'm just tired, officer." "Sure you are." "It's not that nice a car," Vega said before he could stop himself. Dwyer snorted. "You'd be surprised what folks can't afford but still find a way to drive. Hit the plate." Vega typed the numbers into the onboard computer. Clean registration, active insurance, local address. "Comes back to a Lena Harris," he said. "No warrants, no flags." "Uh-huh." Dwyer watched the sedan drift a little as it merged. Late, weaving, maybe drunk, maybe something else. "We'll have a chat. Light her up." The blue and red strobe splashed across Lena's rearview mirror like a sudden wound. Her stomach dropped, that old sour adrenaline rising again, a completely different flavor from what she knew in the OR. She signaled, pulled onto the shoulder, rolled down her window, and put both hands on the wheel where any camera could see them. She could already hear her own voice in some training slide. "When stopped, comply. Move slowly, narrate your actions, de-escalate whenever possible." She inhaled once, deeply, tasted coffee and metal and the faint tang of dried blood on her scrubs. Then she waited. The patrol car pulled in behind her, lights bathing the roadside in pulsing color. Passing traffic slowed, rubbernecking, headlights sweeping across sagebrush and guardrail. Dwyer walked up on the driver's side, hand resting near his weapon. Vega hung back a little, eyes scanning, body cam already rolling. "Evening, ma'am," Dwyer said, voice brisk. "License and registration." "Yes, officer," Lena said. Her voice came out hoarse with fatigue. "My license is in my wallet, right hip pocket. Registration's in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for them now, slowly." She waited for the nod. In a better world, that nod would be automatic. Dwyer looked at her for half a heartbeat longer than necessary, taking in the green scrubs, the army sweatshirt, the tired brown face. "Go ahead," he said. But the skepticism was already there. She moved carefully, narrating each motion. Wallet out, license between fingers, glove box latch clicking as she opened it. Paper registration, slightly crumpled, handed over through the window. While she moved, her ID badge swung on its lanyard, catching the patrol car's spotlight and flashing a small, official glint. Dwyer's eyes flicked down to it. "What's this supposed to be?" he asked. "My military ID," Lena said. "I'm a surgeon at Brook, Major Harris. I just finished a shift." Dwyer took the badge between thumb and forefinger and turned it toward his flashlight. He read the name, the rank, the branch. He saw the extra line. Row E, Human Rights Advisor. His lip curled. "Human rights," he said. "That right?" "Yes, sir," Lena said. "So, you lecture people like me," he said, "on how to do our jobs. It's about the law," Lena said carefully. "About keeping everyone safe, including officers." Every word felt like walking along a narrow ledge. She watched his eyes flatten, something old and bruised and ugly rising up behind them. She'd seen that look before, in different rooms, on different faces. It meant, "You think you're above me." "What are you doing in this part of town at this hour, Major Harris?" Dwyer asked. "Driving home," she said. "I live 15 minutes from here." "Been drinking tonight?" His flashlight swept across the interior of her car, the empty cup in the console, the takeout container on the passenger seat. "No, sir," she said. "Just worked a 24-hour shift. I'm tired, not drunk." "Tired drivers kill people too," Dwyer said. "Step out of the vehicle." Her heart picked up, a little drum under her sternum. "Officer," she said, I'm not refusing. I'm in surgical scrubs. I have open wounds on my hands." She lifted them slightly, showing the faint raw lines where gloves had chafed. "If there's a field sobriety test, I'll comply, but—" "Step out of the vehicle," Dwyer said, louder now, voice pitched just enough to carry into any microphone. Behind him, Vega shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Mark," he said quietly. "Her registration comes back clean. No priors. No—" "You want to drive tonight, rookie?" Dwyer snapped over his shoulder, not taking his eyes off Lena. "Then go sit in the car." Vega shut his mouth, jaw tight. Lena swallowed the flare of anger that rose in her throat. Anger would not help her here. Not on the shoulder of a Texas highway with blue and red lights strobing and a man with his hand near his gun who already felt slighted. She unlocked the door and eased it open, keeping one hand on the roof as she stepped out, the way she'd told young soldiers to do in her lectures. Concrete crunched under her sneakers. The air felt colder out here, the night wind cutting through her sweat. "Turn around," Dwyer said. "Hands on the hood." She obeyed. The metal was still warm from the engine. Her badge swung forward on its lanyard, dangling over the front of her sweatshirt. Behind her, tires hissed on asphalt as cars zipped past. Somewhere down the road, a truck horn blared, long and annoyed. "You know what I see," Dwyer said conversationally, as if they were sharing a joke. "When I see a car like this in the middle of the night with a driver who looks like you?" Lena closed her eyes for just a second. "You see someone who might need help," she said softly. "Or you should." She felt his hand clamp down on her shoulder, harder than necessary. "I see a situation I'm not going to let get out of control," he said. Then everything happened at once. He told her to move her feet apart. She shifted to comply. Her bag, still slung over one shoulder, slid and bumped her hip. She instinctively reached to steady it. "Hands where I can see them," he barked. She froze, fingers barely curling around the strap. "I'm just... drop it!" His voice jumped an octave, more for the recording than from fear. From the patrol car, Vega saw the same motion, the same strap slipping, the same tired woman in scrubs trying to catch her bag. He saw Dwyer's fingers tighten on the grip of his weapon, the way his whole body coiled. "Mark!" he shouted, feet already moving. "Don't!" The night exploded. The sound punched through Lena's world before the pain did, a single deafening crack that turned the highway shoulder into a tunnel. For a heartbeat, she didn't understand that the fire in her side, low and hot, was part of her. She staggered, both hands flying to her abdomen. The badge on her lanyard smacked against her chin. The hood of the car tilted away from her as her knees folded, concrete rushing up to meet her. Somewhere above her, Vega's voice bled into Dwyer's. "I didn't see a weapon! She reached! She reached! You saw it! She was catching her bag! She reached!" Dwyer shouted again, louder, as if volume could turn his narrative into reality. "You heard me tell her to stop! It's on the tape!" Lena lay on the ground, breath shallow. The world narrowed to the pounding of her own pulse in her ears. Training flickered weakly in the back of her mind, pressure, trajectory, organ involvement. The wet warmth under her palm told her where the bullet had gone. The fact that she was still conscious told her something else. "You're not dead." Yet, she tasted asphalt and metal and the metallic tang of her own blood. Above, red and blue light painted the underside of her lashes. "I need a trauma center," she heard herself say, the words warped around pain. "Preferably one I know." The laugh that came from Dwyer was jagged. "Ambulance is on its way," he said. "Just lie still, ma'am. For the record, you refused multiple lawful commands and made a sudden movement toward a concealed object." "For the record," Lena whispered, "you don't even know your own fear from your bias." She wasn't sure if anyone heard her. Then the sirens came, a different pitch this time, the rising wail of EMS, the rest blurred into hands on her body, a cervical collar, a stretcher. As the gurney lifted, her ID badge slipped free of her sweatshirt and dangled in the air again, swinging like a pendulum. One of the paramedics caught it with 2 fingers and frowned at the print. "Major," he said softly. "Hang on, ma'am. We're taking you home." In the bright brutality of the trauma bay at Brooke Army Medical Center, Lena's world narrowed to light and sound and orders that weren't hers for once. BP 90/50 dropping. GCS 14. Single GSW to left lower quadrant through and through. Get me a fast and cross-match 4 units. Let's move. Voices she knew and trusted moved around her body with professional urgency. Someone squeezed her hand. Someone else cut away her sweatshirt and scrubs, exposing the wound to cold air and hot, gloved fingers. "Lena," a nurse's voice said, close to her ear. "It's Jen. We've got you. Don't try to talk." She tried anyway. "Don't let them intubate me if they don't." "Shh," Jen said. "You're the boss in this room whether you like it or not." It was only half a joke. Later, after the OR and the careful route of a bullet's path had been traced and repaired, after anesthesia had turned the world off and then back on, Lena woke in a quiet room, with dimmed lights, and the slow beep of machines. Pain tethered her to her body, sharp but manageable. Morphine's fog blurred the edges of her thoughts, but not enough to erase memory. She saw it again, in pieces. The hood of the car under her palms, the weight of the bag on her shoulder, the flash of weapon metal, the sound. "Welcome back." The voice in the doorway was unfamiliar. Lena turned her head carefully and saw a man and a woman in plain clothes, their IDs hanging from lanyards that looked a little too official to be visitors. The woman stepped forward first. She was in her 40s, hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, suit slightly rumpled from long hours. "Major Harris," she said. "I'm Special Agent Fraser, Army Criminal Investigation Division. This is Captain Malik, JAG Corps." The man gave a small nod. "Ma'am." Lena's throat felt like sandpaper. "So, it wasn't just a bad dream?" "I'm afraid not," Fraser said. "Hey, how much do you remember?" "Everything that mattered," Lena said. "Name tags, commands, the fact that he never once asked me if I was okay after he shot me." Fraser's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "We're very glad you're alive," Captain Malik said. "And we're here because you are not just a victim. You are also a key witness and a subject matter expert in what appears to be a serious civil rights violation." Lena let her head sink back into the pillow. In the corner of the room, the small TV bolted to the wall played muted news, local anchors with somber faces, graphics flashing. Routine traffic stop turns violent. "Officer fires on aggressive driver." Even without sound, she could read the crawl at the bottom. "Police say the driver ignored multiple commands and made a sudden movement toward a concealed object." She closed her eyes. "Of course they do," she murmured. "Ma'am?" Fraser asked. "They're already writing the story," Lena said. "They always do." Her gaze drifted down to her chest, where her hospital gown rustled softly. Someone had looped her ID badge back over her neck. The old bloodstain on the corner had been joined by a newer, brighter smear. "I teach rules of engagement," she said. "I've testified about proportional force. I've given lectures to MPs about how 'I was afraid' is not a magic phrase that erases responsibility." "We know," Captain Malik said. "That's why this case has the Pentagon's attention. And the Department of Justice's." Lena opened her eyes again. "The DOJ?" Fraser nodded. "Civil Rights Division, they've been looped in. When a local department shoots an Army officer who advises on human rights and then labels her a violent black female driver to the press, that tends to ring alarm bells." A laugh bubbled up in Lena's chest and turned into a wince. "Good," she said. "Let them ring." Across town, in a beige cinder-block room that smelled like burned coffee, Officer Dwyer sat at a computer, typing. The words came easily. Subject appeared nervous, furtive movements, reached toward concealed bag despite repeated verbal commands to stop. "Fearing for my safety and the safety of my partner, I discharged my weapon once." He'd written some version of this report more times than he could count. It was a template at this point, a pattern that fit almost anyone he wanted it to fit. He clicked the checkbox that marked his body camera as malfunctioned during incident, a trick he'd learned years ago when he didn't want certain footage reviewed. No one ever checked too hard as long as the audio still uploaded. Behind him, Vega sat rigid in a plastic chair, a blank incident form on the desk in front of him. He could still see her hands on the hood of the car, the way the bag slipped, the way Dwyer had already decided what that meant before she even moved. He thought about his father sitting at the kitchen table the day he graduated from the academy, calloused hands wrapped around a coffee mug. "Be the officer we needed when we first came to this country," his father had said, accent thick with Puebla and drywall dust. "Not the one we feared." Vega stared at the empty lines on his form. "Carlos," Dwyer said without turning around, "you gonna write that up sometime tonight, or what?" "Yes, sir," Vega said. He picked up his pen. Then he set it down again. "Sir," he said carefully. Her registration came back clean. She told you who she was. Her ID said whatever she wanted it to say," Dwyer snapped. "You know how easy it is to print a fake badge? She matched the profile. Late night, wrong part of town, expensive car, attitude. I'm not getting second-guessed by some army paper pusher with a fancy title and an axe to grind." "She didn't have an attitude," Vega said, too quietly for it to be wise, "and she was tired. That's all." For the first time that night, Dwyer turned away from the screen. "Look," he said, "you're new. You still think the world makes sense. But there's stuff you learn out here that they don't teach you in the academy. You trust your instincts or you get dead." She reached. "I reacted. End of story." Vega nodded like he understood. Then later, when he was alone in his apartment with his patrol car's tablet balanced on his knees, he opened the dash cam footage from their unit and watched the end of story from a different angle. He watched the strap slip. He watched her hand move. He watched the flash, the jerk of her body, the way she crumpled. He watched the timeline, too, the little timestamp in the corner of the screen. He saw where the audio from Dwyer's body cam cut out 30 seconds before the shot. He watched it 3 more times, then sat there in the dark with his father's voice in his head and his heart pounding. In the morning, instead of driving straight to roll call, he took a detour. The Army CID office sat in a nondescript building off a service road near Fort Sam, Houston, the kind of place most local cops pretended not to notice. Vega parked outside for a solid 10 minutes, palms sweating on the steering wheel. Then he took a breath, grabbed his tablet, and went inside. 2 weeks after the shooting, Major Harris rolled herself into a conference room on base in a wheelchair she already hated. The room was full before she even arrived. On one side of the long table sat Special Agent Fraser, Captain Malik, and a stern-looking woman in a suit from the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. On the other side, in uniform and uncomfortable, sat the San Antonio police chief, a city attorney, and 2 internal affairs detectives. At the far end, hands folded, was Officer Vega. There was an empty chair where Officer Dwyer was supposed to be. "He'll be brought in after we lay the foundation," Fraser said quietly, as if this were just another surgery and Dwyer were the patient. "No sense letting him tailor his story to everyone else's." Lena maneuvered herself to the head of the table opposite the projection screen. It felt wrong, being at the end rather than the middle, but she said nothing. Captain Malik clicked a remote. The lights dimmed, and Vega's dash cam footage filled the wall. No one spoke for the first 2 minutes. They watched the car drift slightly, signal late, then pull over. They watched Dwyer approach, heard his tone. They watched Lena's hands on the wheel, her careful narration of every movement. They watched Dwyer take her ID badge and make a joke of it. They watched him tell her to step out, to put her hands on the hood. They watched the bag slip. "Pause," the DOJ attorney said. The image froze with Lena's hand halfway to the strap. "Now," she said calmly, "play it at 1/4 speed." They watched it again, slowed. Nothing about Lena's motion looked like someone lunging at a weapon. It looked like someone catching a falling object the way any person would, without thinking. "Again," Lena said. Her voice surprised her with its steadiness. They watched it again. "Now," she said, "contrast that with his report." Captain Malik handed copies of Dwyer's statement down the table. The words were all there. Furtive movements, sudden reach, fear for his life. "Let the record reflect," the DOJ attorney said, "that Officer Dwyer's written account states he gave multiple clear commands before the subject's movement. The footage shows only one command, 'hands where I can see them,' immediately followed by the discharge of his weapon." The police chief shifted in his chair. "That could still be perception under stress," he began. "Perception under stress doesn't turn slow motion into fast," Fraser said. "It doesn't invent commands that were never spoken." The chief's mouth closed. Vega cleared his throat. The sound was small but carried in the quiet room. "There's also the part after," he said, "when EMS took Major Harris away." He looked down at his hands, then back up at the screen. The way he kept saying, "She reached. You saw it. She matched the profile." It was like he was rehearsing for an audience that wasn't there yet. Lena fixed her gaze on the chief. "What profile is that exactly?" she asked. "Black, tired, driving home from work?" The chief held her eyes for a moment, then looked away. On the second day, they brought Dwyer in. He sat across from the footage of his own actions, shoulders squared, jaw clenched. He repeated his phrases like a mantra. She reached. I was scared. It happened fast. It did happen fast, Lena said quietly at one point. Do you know why? He glared at her. Because people like you. Because you escalated, she said, cutting him off. Because you interpreted fatigue as defiance. Because you treated my job title like an insult. Because at every step where you could have slowed down, you chose not to. Dwyer's lawyer put a hand on his arm, but he shook it off. You think you're better than us, he spat, sitting up there in your little classrooms telling us how we're supposed to feel when someone moves wrong in the dark. No, Lena said. I think you're supposed to tell the truth about how you feel, and then act according to the law, not your prejudice. Her voice stayed calm. Her hands, resting on the armrests of her chair, did not shake. Right now, she added, you're doing neither. At the end of the week, the Joint Inquiry Board, half Army officers in dress uniforms, half civilian officials in suits, issued its findings. They found that Officer Mark Dwyer had used unreasonable and excessive force under color of law against a compliant subject. They found that his actions were motivated in part by implicit racial bias, as supported by his own language on the scene and in prior complaints. They found that he had falsified portions of his report. They referred him for federal prosecution under 18 U.S.C. Paragraph 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. They notified the state licensing board that he was unfit for duty as a peace officer. And, at the insistence of the Pentagon, they opened a broader investigation into the patterns of his department. Body cam footage would now be mandatory on every traffic stop, with any malfunction flagged and reviewed by an external auditor. Joint trainings between the Army and local police would include mandatory sessions on rules of engagement and bias, taught not just by commanders but by people like Lena. People who had learned the hard way what happened when training became theater instead of protection. 3 months later, the news anchor's voice floated into Lena's living room from a TV she'd left on low more out of habit than interest. Today announced a partnership with the U.S. Army to reform use of force training after a high-profile shooting of a black Army trauma surgeon earlier this year. The officer involved has been indicted on federal civil rights charges and permanently decertified. In a statement, the department acknowledged a pattern of pretextual stops that disproportionately targeted black drivers. Lena sat on the couch, with a blanket over her lap and a stack of journal articles on the coffee table. Studies about traffic stop disparities, body cam policies, use of force continuums. A half-finished mug of tea cooled at her elbow. Her surgical scar pulled when she shifted, a dull ache that reminded her with every movement that the bullet had been real. On the coffee table lay her ID badge. She'd thought about getting it replaced after the doctors cut it off her neck in the trauma bay and handed it back with a fresh streak of her own blood on the already stained corner. Personnel had offered to print a new one without a word. She'd kept the old one. Now she picked it up, thumb tracing the dried crimson smudge along the edge, old blood from another war, new blood from a highway shoulder in Texas, both fused into the laminate. Her phone buzzed, a text from Captain Malik. Got confirmation from DOJ. Dwyer accepted a plea. 5 years, no badge, ever. Below that, another line. Also, the chief signed the full reform package, data transparency, external review, mandatory training. Your testimony made the difference. Lena stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she typed one word. Good. A second later she added, It's a start. She set the phone down and leaned back, listening as the news segment shifted to something else, something far away. Her body hummed with the familiar low-grade restlessness that came on her days off, the part of her that only felt fully at ease when someone's life was literally in her hands. Tomorrow she would scrub in again for the first major case since the shooting. A kid from a rollover out near the interstate. Maybe a soldier, maybe some teenager whose only crime was being in the wrong car at the wrong time. She would stand in the OR under bright lights and make 1,000 small decisions to keep him alive. And somewhere, out on some dark stretch of highway, another officer would make a handful of decisions that could undo all of her work in a heartbeat. But maybe, after all this, some of those officers would think twice, Maybe one of them would remember a training slide with a scarred black woman in army green talking about fear and law and the difference between them. Maybe one of them would see a driver's tired hands on a steering wheel and say, "Ma'am, you look exhausted. Let me call you a tow. Let me get you home safe." Maybe not. Justice, she told her patients and her cadets alike, wasn't a destination. It was a practice, like surgery. You prepared. You showed up. You did the work, even when you were tired, even when no one was watching, because the alternative was letting rot set in. She looked down at the ID badge in her hand. Harris Lena M. Maje MC, U.S. Army. Rowe, Human Rights Advisor. And clipped it back onto her lanyard. When she stood up, the scar in her side twinged, a hot line of memory. She let it. Some reminders were worth keeping. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance and faded. Lena walked to the window and looked out at the city she served in too many ways to count. San Antonio's lights flickered under the dark like a circuit board. Somewhere in that grid, a kid would grow up safer because one officer's career had ended and a department had been forced to change. It wasn't enough, but it was more than nothing. She rested her palm briefly over the scar at her side and then let her hand fall, fingers brushing the cool plastic of her badge as it swung. "Rules of engagement," she whispered to herself, "for everyone this time." Then she turned away from the window, toward the stack of articles and the cold mug of tea and the work that never really ended, and got back to it.